value life cycle for us, because when we started this Spark, all our focus was on improving the performance of Spark, understanding the internals. Then we started working on how to productionize it, how to build enterprise applications on top of that. And that's where you need to work with these tools. So that's where we started looking into these tools and trying to understand which one would do good for your particular requirement. So one thing about all these meters talk is that you don't trust them just by what they say there or what they think there. You need to look at you need to analyze the options, you need to work with, experiment with those tools and see which one suits you. Because if you look at any of the Spark demo, they do that with a notebook application, either Zeppelin or Jupyter, right? There are very few talks or demos that go beyond that, and even if they do either ML or something in that line. That's primarily because Spark, the major or the primary focus when it came was for doing data science, right? Data scientists are the target users, and that's where it started. But later on it evolved, so we'll talk about this during the course. So this will be the agenda. So I'll just give an overview of the interactive analytics. Then we'll talk about the different users or the potential users of a Spark ecosystem or Spark applications. Then we'll talk about Spark context, because we just want to briefly touch on Spark context, because that is like the common thread across all these interactive tools, whatever they may be. And then we'll talk about, I'll just walk you through whatever the native Spark provided shells for doing interactive application. And then we'll do more on the other things which are built on top of the native Spark shells. So that would be like Zeppelin or Jupyter and IBM Spark kernel, which is called the Apache Tauri now, and also briefly on the Cloudera DB. So these are the different things that we will talk about. So just to give a context, right? So a typical data science application life cycle is this. So first you explore data. So there's a lot of data exploration and analysis involved here. And then once you're done with the data exploration, you understand the data, then you start building models using that data. And once you are done with the modeling, then you try to evaluate your model with more data. And finally, once you are done and you are satisfied with the results of the models, then the model gets deployed in production. Actually, overkill, it stops there, but in real life, even the model's performance is continuously monitored, and the model is continuously improved. That's how the real data set. So, as I said, the primary user group for us is like the data scientist, and that's why there is a lot of interactive tools available, primarily focused on data scientists. The next group is the data. So data scientists, like the typical work is like they do the data exploration, data wrangling, and they do the model building. So you can build either predictive model or the more advanced prescriptive models now. And then you do, so these guys have some knowledge in programming, especially in maths and in statistics. And they use either R or Python or SPSS, MATLAB. These are the built-in tools available. And they do a lot of analytics using interactive shells. So that's their interface primarily. And the next group is the data analysts. So these are guys within the enterprise who understand the various data sources, data systems, and how they're interlinked. So these guys do ad hoc analysis as well, but they do a lot of reports which are built in the enterprise. The next group is the business analysts. So they are not programmers, they are industry experts primarily, and their focus is mostly on the business processes and on how to improve them, how to come up with improved processes, improved systems, So their focus is mainly that, and they do use a lot of reporting. And finally, data engineer, application developer who actually productionize the models, who build the data pipelines so that all this analysis can be done. And so their primary interface will be something which is not more GUI based. And one thing you need to notice is these roles are often interlapping, right? Like business analyst and data analyst. Sometimes the data scientist gets to do everything in an hour, depending on the hour. It's not like you have well-defined roles to or well-defined people doing each of these tasks. So they may play one or multiple roles depending on that particular organization. So they may use multiple tools as well. So this is like a overview of tools that we will talk about later. The first is Jupyter. So Jupyter is the web-based notebook application which uses IBM Spark kernel to talk to Spark. Then you have Zeppelin, which has its own way of talking to Spark. Then we have, so those who are the Spark provided in Spark Shell and Spark Summit. Then we have the Spark job server. This was one of the oldest Spark products available. This is used to do job submission on Spark using a REST interface. And we also have Livy. Livy is again a REST-based server. So Cloudera Hue has an uses Livy to talk to Spark. And so this is just a very high level mapping, where which tools are used by which group of people. Again, as I said, people can use one or more of these tools that the other said as well. And like for example, there is nothing stopping from a data analyst to use partially, if he wants to use. So, but this is like the primary set of tools that we expect them to use. And if you see like Spark maybe and the Thrift server, so these provide interfaces which other tools can use and build upon. So they are not the interfaces themselves. So now let me go deep into this Spark context, because irrespective of how you talk to Spark, whether it's through Zeppelin, through Jupyter, or Spark Shell, or Spark Summit, or Livy, the Spark context is one thing which is the common thread across all these application interfaces. So, because the Spark context is the one where you really say, how you want to, what is the configuration that you want to use for a specific application. So, and I mean, this is the place where say which cluster you want to talk to, and how many drivers you want, how many executors you want, what is the the core requirement for a specific job. So all that is held here. This is the handle to create RDBs, your data frames, your accumulators, process variables, etc. And this gives the interface to run jobs, to submit job and to cancel job. And the most important thing which is kind of a limitation is also that there is only one Spark context within a JVM. So what this means is like for every user connection, if you want to have a user isolation, it has to go through a separate Spark context. So your application typically has to have that many Spark contexts based on the number of users if you want to provide complete isolation on the data objects that they are working on. So this is primarily important. This is very important in the case of a data science use case, because people do a lot of data analysis. They do a lot of temporary object creation. So you need to have a user isolation between different user contexts so that they don't interfere with each other's work. And so having said that, so it also supports parallel job submission, and it has its own scheduler as well. So it supports both FIFO and fast scheduler. This fast scheduler is similar to what was there in Hadoop. So I'll talk about that briefly. So typically what happens is, and this can be done using parallel threads. And the next set of tools are the GUI-based tools. Maybe I'll just show a small summary. So this is a small jar, which is okay, so this is just to show a small application using Spark Submit. So this is this class. This is how you actually run a Spark Submit, and you call this particular jar that you have created. And once you run it, so again this creates a UI. So you can see here that the UI started at 43, which I have already. So yeah, so you can see your job here, and so it had 2 stages, and you can see each stage, the metrics for each stage, the tag for a particular stage, and the overall status of the JavaScript here. So that's a very small example of how to use this Spark Submit. And then I would go to the Zeppelin. So these are what are the interfaces that I showed so far typically used by the developers. It's not for end users. So now when you come to the end users, the data scientists or the analysts, so this is a very, these tools would help them interact with Spark. And again, so when they started, it's primarily like focused on one user. So the data scientist will come and he would open a notebook, as they call it here, and they will start working with whatever data exploration, data analysis they do, and finally they save it, they share that from other scientists, or they can build a whole story on top of that. So Notebook is very good in that. It's not just just getting a data done. So you can build your own story, even your models using that, and finally present it to someone else, and it can be shared. And so Zeppelin is one of the popular notebooks. There are other notebooks available. This is one of the popular ones. And so the architecture is like this. So there is a Zeppelin server which runs and which provides the interface for your UI. And within the server, there are multiple interpreter groups. So each interpreter group is a particular JVM process that gets launched. Spark has a specific interpreter group, so it supports multiple interpreters underneath that, like Scala, R, Python. So all that is supported in one particular interpreter group. So that one JVM which holds one particular context, Spark context for you. So anything that you submit to Zeppelin will go through that. So this is good as a single user. You get your own Zeppelin, you run it. When you want to do an enterprise, so I think the most, so as I said, like if I have a Zeppelin server and if 2 users want to work on that, the context would be the same. So the typical deployment architecture that is followed in multiple application use cases is like create a separate instance of Zeppelin for each user so that their context is separate. So either they use Docker containers or some other method of creating a new Zeppelin instance, so that every user will talk to his own context with which he will interact with Spark. It uses this, actually the Zeppelin right now has it creates this Spark context by default when you launch it and even work with it. It uses the Thrift protocol to talk between the interpreter group and the Zeppelin server. And there are like multiple enhancements being done, and they also have something called a Zeppelin Hub where you can share your notebooks and publicly available notebooks for other users to look into. So this is one thing that is widely used, and so I'll show a brief demo with that.
Does this support R also?
Yeah. But since I don't know R, I only show you code. Yeah, so once you start your Zeppelin, so once this is the interface with which you connect to, this is the homepage, and you can see the different nodes that you have created here, and you can open any item, and then it will start. So at this point, it is actually not run anything; it is showing the past run. So you can share it and even export it and save it with other users. And there are multiple modes here. So if you go into a report mode, basically the users won't get to see any of the code here. They just see the output of the things that you ran. So let me just run it here. So that is to run the entire thing. So I'll just start. So it has this markdown syntax support. So you can write a lot of commentary along with your with your data and present it as a story, as a complete report. So you can run. So each one of this is called a paragraph, and it is run code. And so by default it is in Spark. So you can keep running your Spark queries. So this is. So I'm reading a sample data set which has some data on the Titanic actually. So this is the schema of that particular data set. So
are you passing the data?
So yeah, the data I have downloaded the data. So you can see here it is loaded in the main directory here. And to read the data, you need so there are multiple data source APIs. So data source APIs are available, which give you the option to read data.
You can stand there. I will move the slides.
So as you can. Yeah. So you can see here this contra database.spark.csv. That's the it's available in the Spark packages. So they have given this multiple packages over there to read data, and these are the data source APIs as they call it.
I would ask, like, this data a user is uploading from the system to the server, right, for processing?
Yes. If you have this data with you, you have to load it. Right? Or you can give, if you have an enterprise HDFS and you have the data there, you can point to that. Okay. And so this is like you just read the data, you specify the format of the data, the option where the first row is selected, and then you say info schema, so that will automatically create the schema for you. Then you give the location of the data. So this is a very simple use case. So this gives you the data. So it says that this is the structure of your file. So it has a column called class, then the job matrix here. So this is the, so as I said, like whenever you launch any driver, it also creates a UI for you. And you can go and look at the metrics for a particular job. And so this is the one that I ran just now. So we just ran some queries and you can see, you know, the particular job that got submitted from
So when you say the last slide, data frame, so when you say this time table, so where it is like actually getting created in memory or somewhere in the temporary table when you show up the Spark context that will vanish. Where it is getting created?
Yeah, it's a temporary table. So once a particular application goes up, that will be gone. So
In memory, right?
yeah, it's in memory, right? So there is a save as table option which you can process. You can use to persist your data, and that will be available within that particular. Again, so there is a meta story which gets created when you launch a driver, and you can point to a common meta store as well, so that if you want to use like you have an enterprise-wide warehouse, you've got of tables there, and like for example, you use MapReduce or Hive, and you already have those tables created in Hive. You can use those tables if you point to a particular Hive meta store, so that everybody in the company can refer to the same data set from their queries against that.
So, but during query, it will always load the data, or always will it always point to a Hive table or SDFS table, or it will load the data in memory?
Yeah, if it is not there in the memory already, it has to load the data in memory.
But how will make sure that it's not going out of memory?
No, it won't go out of memory because so it can still do this. So it's not like I think that was one of the the initial thoughts about Spark, that it will load every data into memory and you are always limited by the memory size, but that's not really true. So it can spin onto this as when it's needed when it's trying out of memory.
Like as per the query, I'm saying it's like the query is on an entire data set. It's not some chunk of data. So
yeah.
I was asking you that.
Okay, yeah. So irrespective of the amount of data, like you can load like any amount of data, and it will still process it. It's just that it has to split it to the disk for intermediate calculations.
As a developer, like we need to take care of this, or like by default, Spark takes care of this. I have a billions of data set, like I use data. I want to do some analytics on top of that. So do I need to make sure that I'm actually getting some particular chunk of data and it's going into memory by default Spark takes care of?
Yeah, so there are two aspects to that. One is like, what is your requirement, right? Like, if you need to process this whole data set, then you may have to have a cluster which will support that amount of data. And having said that, it is not that you need to process 1 terabyte of data. It's not that you need to have a RAM of 1 terabyte, from your cluster. It will spill and it will process it chunk by chunk and it will give the complete results.
There are knobs to tweak it. You can say disk only, memory and disk only.
So when you say like using that temporary table in the data frame, so if you use this Spark streaming, so in that case, so that data frame table will be based on the per packet, the per batch, or it's like we can store the whole data, okay, the whole day we are having, so that data will be in the temporary table. Or it's really like per batch, when we say, okay, we are reading per 30 seconds, per 5 seconds, and create a register temporary table and do that.
So how you are doing it, like streaming batch dot for each RDD, then you create a data frame there? Or you say window dot, then in the window operation you create a data frame?
So yeah,
that data frame works only that window data.
Okay, then I would like to take the window period, say,
that means you only answer, na? Window have the, whatever data is there in that window will represent that table.
That's right.
When next window comes, the table represents the
next window comes and there will be new data.
New data.
It will override data.
Override data.
Yeah, right.
So I think, yeah, so this is again the standard UI. So you can see here by default, the admin goes to the fast scheduler. And once you have a fast scheduler, you also get scheduler pools created, which is not the case otherwise in the default scheduler mode. So you can see that there is a default pool as well as a fire pool. So what happens is like, so now once you go for this batch scheduler and it creates a pool, you can even set the scheduling mode for each pool. So you can set the scheduling mode. You can see here that for default, they have set the scheduling mode for FIFO, and for the fast scheduler pool, it's fast. So again, the same resource allocation approach is controlled for each pool. At a high level, you can set the link share for each pool so that they will get some resources, and within that particular pool, you can also control how multiple jobs will get submitted. By default, again, it will be like the sequential one, so the first job will execute and then the second job gets submitted. So again, this is an input when you submit your job. So I think that's all for Zephyr. So again, this is the same UI for any driver that you see. And the next one that I'll be talking about is Jupyter. So Jupyter is the latest iteration of what we call as IPython. So earlier it was just one project where you had the IPython interface with the IPython kernel. Then they have splitted the UI part of it and separated the kernels. So you can have any number of kernels. Actually, there are like some 30-40 kernels available with which for different languages, and you can work with different systems using those kernels. And the UI will be the notebook interface. So this is a brief or a short overview of the architecture. So this is how they talk to. They use this IPython protocol to talk between the UI to the server, to the kernel. And as I said earlier, the only kernel that we will talk about is the Spark kernel in detail. Obviously, because it's developed by everyone in open source, it's called Apache Kernel now, and we'll go a little bit deeper into that. It's not much, and so you can see here that. This is again a web-based notebook, which is exactly similar to Zephyr, although the whole approach here is more modularized. So you need to get the different packages installed for doing different operations like display, for charting, and it has this concept of kernels, which is not there, which is slightly different in Zephyr. So here you can plug in your kernels. Using the configuration, and it works on IPython messaging protocol. So basically it works on a fixed number of ports, like it uses some 5 ports to talk between the kernel and the UI. And now it's open source and it's available as product. And I'll just show a brief UI interface to that. Yeah, you can see that. Okay. So this is the home page of this particular notebook interface. So I'm running all of this on my local because so that would be easier for me to show the demo. So I can open a particular notebook or I can create a new notebook. So by default, again, it comes with the Spark context because it's a. So when you create a notebook, you have to say like. So right now I have only 2 kernels available. So you can add more kernels depending on the kernel. Like for R, you can add such a kernel. So right now I'm creating. So this is how you get a new notebook. So when you create a new notebook, it will start its own kernel. It will start something called the kernel instance for that, and so this is my notebook. So this is something I did to get the Sparks loaded data source, because I have done this in Jupyter as well. So both these tools give a way to load your dependencies, any classes that you want to load. So this is called Magic Sphere, this add depth command. So once you have this Magic Sphere and you give a specific package, which is a Maven package, so in this format, like group ID, artifact ID, and version, it will go and do a complete dependency check and pull all the required modules that you may need and put it in the local repo. So, in Zeppelin it is done. They used to have this similar dependency command, but right now you can also give it as a UI interface. So, so you have an option to configure your interpreter, and you can give your dependencies over here. And it would restart that particular interpreter with the dependencies loaded for you automatically. And that's how you use external dependencies. And so I have loaded the exact same data set here. As I said, like you need to get this additional jars loaded for this particular charting packages which I have not done. So I'm just doing DSL operations to show the data. And yeah, so this is exactly similar, and this is also widely used, and there's a lot of community support for this as well, because it's been there for a long time. Jupyter is the latest version, so IPython was there for a long time, and then they started this Jupyter project. Even the Bluemix instance, that the cloud platform that IBM has, Spark, that comes with Jupyter rather than Zeppelin. And that's one of the, and it has a good support because again the kernel is written by IBM, so we use the Spark kernel here, which will give you the interface to talk to Spark. And so again it's exactly the same thing when it comes to the driver. So you can see the UI for this as well. So anything you launch there, yeah. So this is the port at which the driver UI runs for this for Jupyter Notebook, and you can see here that you can see the exact same thing. Like you can have the jobs, and you can see the scheduling mode is default by default, and yeah, you can see all the configurations and how what are the jobs that it needs and what are the flows here. So that's pretty much about Jupyter. Again, then there is also something called Apache Hue, but not Apache, it's a Cloudera Hue which is open source, and they get the Hue as a part of the CDH package. And Hue also comes in Spark notebooks, which is exactly similar to what is there in Zeppelin and Jupyter. So if your company or if your setup has CDH, then you can probably look at Hue and the Spark notebooks over there, which provides exactly the same set of features. I think I'm done with this particular thing, so maybe we can break for 10 minutes, and then shall we start with the next set of slides. So,
like developer driven, like when I start first playing around with Spark, the first thing I do is open Spark shell and start typing some commands and seeing how my things are working. And then we saw the notebooks. So now we will, in this hub, we will see some solutions which are there, which can be used to build like applications on top of Spark. So let's say you are Spark shell, Spark Summit doesn't suffice for you, notebooks are not enough for you, and you need like some more application which has, you want to build your own application with a UI or something, and you need some middleman to talk to Spark. Then the other three tools that we're going to talk about, they can help us in that matter. So let's get started with Spark kernel. It's now called as Apache Tori. It's an Apache incubator project now. So this Spark kernel was started at IBM, and it's like gaining popularity. So basically, kernel kind of a proxy. It acts as like a kind of a proxy between your Spark cluster and your application. Your application can be like so basically it's built on the IPython protocol. So it integrates very seamlessly with the Jupyter notebook we saw earlier. So when we were talking about that notebook and the Spark kernel that it was talking to, it is this kernel, the Spark kernel. So Jupyter also is on the IPython protocol, kernel is also on the IPython protocol, so they just integrate seamlessly and you can directly start using kernel to talk to Spark from the Jupyter notebook. Or what you can do is you have your application and you can use the kernel client library to talk to this kernel instance. So kernel basically acts as your middleman between your Spark cluster and your applications. It can sit within the cluster or it can also sit outside the cluster and talk to your Spark cluster. So when you start your kernel instance, you already have a pre-configured Spark context, and one kernel instance always has one Spark context, and you can have multiple clients talking to this kernel instance, and you can query from your clients, which we'll see later. So we'll spend a little bit time on this kernel architecture. So as I said, kernel implements the IPython message protocol. It uses 0MQ as its messaging middleware. So as part of this protocol, there are supposed to be 5 sockets on which your messages are supposed to go out and go in. So like Heartbeat is one of the sockets which is supposed to basically check whether a kernel is alive or not. Shell is a socket on which all your communication from the clients comes to the kernel. All your code execution, your code snippets come from the clients to the kernel. Control is like a higher priority shell, which basically is meant for shutdown signal or something like that, okay, go and kill my kernel. And we have stdin socket, which is basically meant for any kind of std out or std error messages from the kernel to the client. And your IO pub is like, it's like to broadcast your outputs and your results to all the various clients. It's that kind of a socket. So kernel is basically listening on all those 5 sockets, and you have below that 0MQ layer, you have another layer for the whole message handling. So you get these 0MQ bytes, and then you're supposed to, then the next thing is basically to do a message parsing. So what you do is you process these bytes into your JSON strings, and then they get converted into a message format that the kernel understands. So that once your message passing is done, it is routed to your different message handlers. So message handler is like you have different things you can do in kernel. You can do a code execution in kernel, or you can there is something called as a COM API also in kernel, which we will take a brief look at it later on. So that handler is different from your code execution handler. So you are routed to the appropriate handler. Your message gets routed to the appropriate handler. And then, let's say your handler was the code execution handler. You're supposed to go and execute my code in Spark. So you have the Spark interpreter handler, rather actor below it, which is going to handle, take this message and execute it on Spark. So all these layers and everything are basically Akka actors, and that's the execution flow which takes place inside, but everything is actors. So the last layer, which actually talks to Spark, your Spark interpreter, is also an actor, and it basically has 2 main things. One is so basically the Spark interpreter is nothing but actually a wrapper on the Spark shell class. So actually what kernel does is it launches Spark shell class on the Spark cluster. So it has 2 main things there. One is the class server and one is the Spark context. So when you start your kernel, it loads this interpreter actor, and your Spark context gets started. And along with that, it also starts a class server. So class server is like just exactly what Spark shell does. When you write your code snippet on Spark shell, it gets compiled, and it is hosted on a class server so that it is available for your executors to go and pick it up from there. So that's the architecture which kernel has, and let's go. Yeah, so basically the same thing. How does it talk to Spark? Like, so let's say that that's my kernel and I want to start my kernel. How do you start your kernel? So you have a script which you start, which basically does what? It does a Spark submit on the cluster with the kernel main class, and it works with your local Spark, standalone Spark, or even Spark on Yarn. And these are two mandatory environment. Sorry, one is the mandatory environment variable which you need, which is a Spark home. So wherever you are running your kernel, you need a Spark client there. So a Spark home has to be set there. And Spark underscore OPTS is another optional environment variable where you can pass in all your config parameters, which is similar to what you pass to Spark submit. Let's say you want to run it on Yarn. So you will say your master is Yarn and your deploy mode is, let's say, Yarn client, or you will say my number of executors is something and 3 and my memory, driver memory is this much. So all those variables get passed in Spark underscore OPTS variable. So like I said, it uses the same Scala interpreter as Spark shell, and it holds a Spark context and the class server URL. So let's say you started your kernel, it's talking to Spark, and how do you now communicate with kernel? So there are two main forms of communication. One is the client library, and other thing is the directly talking to kernel, like Jupyter Notebook talks. So we saw a bit of that. So kernel client library, this is a Scala library which is provided by the kernel team. So this client library is exactly the same architecture as the kernel. It has the same layers, the same, in fact, even the same code base. So it eliminates your need to understand 0MQ messages and decipher them and try to do something with them. All that is taken care by the client. So you have the same kind of thing, that your client is also listening on those 5 ports, and it's just the reverse of what kernel was doing. So it's going and routing your messages to the appropriate handlers. So once your message from the kernel passes through all these layers, client library exposes APIs. APIs like execute, like mainly it's the execute API, which goes and you can execute commands on Spark using that execute API. So now there are 2 steps to using your client. One is you initialize the client with the connection details of the kernel. And second thing is you use the execute API to run code snippets with attached callbacks. We'll see that now. So let me just walk you through a bit of how to start your kernel and your client. So I'm not going to do these steps now because they take a bit of time, but I'll just tell you that to start your kernel, you can go to this Spark kernel repository, and you can build your kernel from there. And you start your kernel using a command something like this, and you basically when you start your kernel, you get a connection profile of the kernel. So it will show you all the 5 ports on which the kernel is listening, and it will also give you the IP on which the kernel is running. So this is where you are starting your kernel. This could be in the Spark cluster or somewhere in the middle, and once this is up, then you will need to talk to it using the client. So client library is not yet in some Maven repository or in some repository, is you have to build the client library also. So so basically from the same code base, you can do you can follow these steps. These links are there in the PPT, and you can follow these steps, and your client library will get published to your local SBT repository, and then you can include it as part of your code. So let's just Zero-MQ is an implementation of your IPython port. So it's a messaging middleware. So
are you storing the calls there in IPython?
yeah, so it's a queue. So you have all the messages coming in there. It's like a publisher-subscriber model.
Something like the bytebaits should be synchronized. How are you maintaining that?
So this is all taken care of by the Zero-MQ implementation. So kernel is also not doing anything special over there. So that layer is taken care of by your Zero-MQ implementation.
That's for keeping the asynchronous part of the flow. So the client to the kernel is not a sync block call; it's an async call.
So sometimes you need a sync, like heartbeat and all that. How do you?
So this is not for heartbeat. Heartbeat is the heartbeat is checked internally by the system. This is purely for you communicating from the client side to the server side. So if you constantly keep it like a sync call, in one client you can execute only one command. So the complete for scalability, that's why they are leveraging Akka model inside. For that, it works purely on the messaging system in between the client. And for that is the messaging middleware is the zero.
So I have another question. So the client which you have developed now, it seems to be like only with Scala.
Yeah, the client is provided by the kernel team,
Yeah.
and it is a Scala library.
Scala library.
Yeah.
So I would not be able to use for Python.
No, you can use, so basically the client is a Scala library, but what the code snippets that you pass inside can be your Python or R code snippets. The thing is, you need to start your kernel with that interpreter. So the default interpreter which comes with kernel is the Scala interpreter, the Spark interpreter, and there is a command line option where you can give your PySpark interpreter or R interpreter. And once you start your kernel with that, the code snippets sent inside the client library can be your Python or R code snippets also. So this is like just a small example of how to use kernel. So the thing is, with this client library, you need to create a client object. So you have to have this profile JSON. This is a connection profile JSON to your kernel. The same thing where this comes from the output that comes on the screen when you start the kernel. So when you will be starting a kernel in some place, you will get a connection profile like this, which is the same thing that you will be connecting to here. So you parse that config and you start your client, you create a client object. Once you have your client object, you can use an execute API of the client object to execute your whole code. So basically your code has to go in like a snippet into this execute API. Now there are these callbacks which are defined on the execute API. So this is a async call, so it will not block here. Even these callbacks are like all async. So basically you will not be blocking anything over here. So you need to put a kind of wait for it or do sleep or do something here. And so these callbacks, you can define what happens in these callbacks. So like you have these methods like on success, print success. So something like you have this method called print success, you can just print a message, or you can retrieve values from what you got as a message from the kernel. And similarly on result and on stream. So on stream is what is like I'll be using right now to print the results of this this execution. So you see this print stream content. So this is what it will go into stream content. So this is my code snippet. This code is basically a very simple code. It looks a little like the way we have to give it here with all those quotation marks and everything. It looks a little big, but it's a very simple thing. You create a case class with your schema kind of thing, like what all attributes you want in your data frame. And you create a data frame from this case class, and you just do a data frame dot group by country, and you do an average of your sales. So let's say I want to execute some code like this. So what I will do is, I have already my kernel running here on my local system. So I just need to do like go ahead and run this class. So it will just take a bit of a time to.
Font.
Sorry.
Font. Command shift plus.
Is it okay? Yeah, so we saw that this code got executed, and we just printed out our data frame, and we just printed out the further operations that we did on data frame, which was a group by and an average of sales. So here is the kernel which was running. So kernel started off this job, and you can see that kernel executing all those commands here. So that was the client library. I'll be putting this code on Git. So right now it's not there, but we will be putting there soon.
What is the main benefit of kernel? Why do you use it?
So the main benefit of kernel is like it gives you like a pre-configured Spark context. So you have like a kernel running somewhere, and you have your code which has a client library to talk to kernel. Your kernel is able to, because it uses Akka, and it is able to scale, and it is able to provide you a fault-tolerant way of talking to Spark. So you have like one Spark context there. You can have your multiple users who can come and interact with your Spark. So yes, there are other tools also which we will talk about, like Livy and Job Server. But with kernel, you can have these sort of code snippet execution that you can do on Spark via your application. So as it is client library, you may not be able to use it in any application. You will have to probably wrap it with a REST interface or something so that you can use it in like some UI or some application of yours. So yeah, so but for like if you have like one Spark context for something like a reporting kind of a solution, let's say you want to have some kind of a reporting solution with a data warehousing kind of solution where your primary use case is just to go and make queries, just to read, and you're not doing a data science kind of a use case where you have to like go and create new data sets and see whether these what are my data sets, you want to play around with them. It's not really meant for that use case. It's more meant for a place where you want to do build a kind of a reporting solution on top of your Spark cluster. So you can if you're okay with one Spark context, you can just use one kernel instance. And if you have multiple users come to the same kernel instance. But if you want like multiple Spark contexts there, and suppose you want to do some kind of user isolation in this solution, then you go for like multiple kernel instances, and you manage those kernel instances and have your clients talking to them. So something like that.
Just adding one point. So your question is why kernel? So let's say you design your own UI, and you have users coming in to do interactive analytics through your own UI. So you build a middleware layer, a web service layer, where the UI passes in commands, and the web service sends to Spark. There is really no technology available today provided basically by Spark to do this interactive analytics in a three-tier architecture. You need to pick up, because you can only do a Spark survey, which is not the best way in interactive analytics. Right? Where a user is sitting in the UI, typing in some commands, your own, it can be a widget, it can be like your own widget box. It's not a programming model of doing analytics. Right? In that case, you have to pick up any one of the technologies here for you to interact, the middleware to interact with the Spark cluster. And that is the biggest use case of why you need any one of them, whether it's Livy, kernel, or anybody. Because Spark doesn't basically provide a default way for you to interact with technology which you're going to interact. Now the user says, I want to do a command something, data frame operation. So internally what you do is, I give 3 different operations and I want to do parallelly do it. How do you do it in Spark Submit? Because here what you do is, it's a complete async operation. So the client object, what it will do is, it will keep on sending all the 3 commands, which are parallel commands, or 3 parallel pipelines, and it can wait parallelly for each of the individual output to come back. Realistically, how you will end up doing in a Spark Submit in this use case? Because the user is constantly firing. He's firing n different commands constantly, and he's waiting for reports, show me all these reports. So these type of use cases, you can't really build Spark Submit. You can't use it. That's why all the 3 technologies came out, whether it is Job Server is not the best one, it's kernel or Livy Cloudera product, all these 2 came out just to satisfy this need of doing interactive from your own UI, outside of Spark Shell or Jupyter or anything. Then you build your own UI.
And also, I think it also maintains the session for the different users.
So that is what she was trying to tell, right? The Spark context is 1 per user, which it manages. So if you want 10 different users to come into your UI and do your own operation behind your middleware, she'll walk in.
Yeah, so that's what, like, if your use case is like just a reporting kind of use case where you just want to, you don't want to do creating a different data sets kind of a thing. You don't want user isolation. So you can just, with the same Spark context, same kernel instance, you can have multiple users. Kernel gives you this capability to scale and be able to do parallel queries. But if you have a use case where you want this user isolation, then you have to separate out your kernels. You have to have different kernels and have your user to kernel mapping kind of a thing. And then you can leverage kernel for that use case.
So each kernel will have its own Spark or?
No, so kernel can you can talk to the same Spark, same Spark cluster, different kernel instances you can have on the same Spark cluster. different kernel instance means a different Spark context. So you won't be like able to share your resources across these Spark contexts. You won't be like able to share your data frames or your RDDs across these Spark contexts.
See, the real issue is actually how do you isolate? That is still not built into any of these technologies. Let's say I have a middleware which is serving for all the users of the UI. There are 10 users who are coming in my UI, different places, and I have a single middleware area which handles all these requests. So now how do I ensure each user has its own isolation in the Spark? That is not provided by kernel alibi. That you have to build an in-between mapping layer telling that in the middleware, users coming from any place, I have a mapping to this particular kernel. So that mapping, you have to build it. It's not given by any of the product outside of this. So that is one more thing which is a feature needed for all these products, but it's not mature still.
Yeah.
Using kernel, we are passing multiple requests, right? So can users pass request to kernel and it will share that part context to the job, right? So how we limit, like one user should not call the system and maybe can consume all the bandwidth and other users will get it solved. So do we have a mechanism to say this everything?
So we control through YARN because it's going to the cluster. So each of these users, we create a YARN queue for it and we control the resources on the YARN queue. So when you're going to the cluster mode, each resource, let's say you are a user who are pumping in this much, like hundreds of queries, but you are allocated only 2 core 50 GB, this much, how many hour processor you want to allocate, only that much executors will run for you. And based on what Bhagwat was explaining before, whether you are using a fair scheduler or not, accordingly your jobs will be picked up, but only from the resources allocated to you in the YARN queue for a single user. So if you have 10 users, you'll pretty much ensure there are 10 YARN queues for you, and each user get a slice of the resource that you've configured before.
Can we distribute this 10 users collectively for each user will be health limit? Can we restrict that part of them?
Can you repeat the?
Restrict the part of it for each user out of which this is the memory, this is the CPU cycle. So for each user we will get this cycle.
Yes. The YARN queue is exactly like that. For each user, how much resources in the cluster you will get. You can exactly tell you will get 5 executors, 2 core, 50 GB RAM. That's all you will get. You can allocate. That's exactly the purpose of the YARN queue.
So we saw a demo for like a small example of using kernel client. So another thing that kernel provides, which we have not really used and we haven't really found a good use case for it, but there is one more API which the kernel provides, and that is a COM API. So using the same client library, there is also a COM API which you can use to communicate data between client and the kernel. So this is specifically meant for places where you do not want to like keep executing, like keep compiling your code and execute it again. So if you want to do like same kind of action for some kind of messages, then you can use this COM API. So it has like what you have to basically do is you have to first open the channel between the client and the kernel. You can then send a message from either the client or the kernel. It can work both ways, and then you close the channel. So what you do is you define message handlers on both the client and the kernel side, and you say that for this kind of message, this is what I want to do on the client side, and for this kind of message, this is what I want to do on the kernel side. So for that kind of, if you want to have that kind of data synchronization, then you can use this COM API. I don't have an example for this, but this is one of the other things that kernel gives. It's it's quite a useful thing, I think, if you want that kind of data synchronization. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is Livy. So that was kernel. This is another solution by Cloudera, which is called Livy. So Livy is an open source REST implementation for interacting with Spark. So Livy supports talking to Spark locally, Spark on a standalone cluster, or Spark on YARN. And it works, it has a Scala interpreter, it has a PySpark interpreter, it has an R interpreter. And so what Bhagwat mentioned about the Hue notebook earlier, so Hue provides Spark integration through Livy. So Livy has this REST interface. Now Livy has so if we take a look at that image there, which describes the Livy architecture, Livy has basically a concept of sessions. So if the first thing that you need to do when you use Livy, you need to create a session in Livy. So what we mean by creating a session in Livy is it launches a Spark submit on the cluster, And the Spark Summit launches basically a Spark interpreter on the cluster for that session. So there is a mapping which Livy maintains from this session, that is my Spark interpreter on the cluster. So how does it access that Spark interpreter on the cluster? It spawns another REST web server on the cluster where the Spark interpreter is running. So now you have a callback URL, REST URL for your session. So that mapping, which we will like, something like what we were just talking about, that if you have multiple users, you need to do a mapping of your user to Spark context. Something like that is what Livy is doing with sessions. So it maintains this mapping between session and the Spark interpreter that it launched in the cluster. So this diagram, we can see that it's doing that Spark interpreter on the cluster and maintains that map in that session manager. So let's see a small demo of Livy.
In the previous diagram, Yarn master is resource manager or the application master. It's application specific or the cluster, entire cluster resource manager.
This Yarn master?
Yeah.
This is the resource manager. Yeah. So, I have already started Livy on my local machine. So Livy also, you can just go to Git, pull it out and build it, and you can start a Livy server like this. So Livy expects you to give Spark Home environment variable when you start Livy. And if you are like starting Livy with Yarn, then it also expects you to have Hadoop conf directory as an environment variable. And you can give, there are other command line options which are also there with Livy server. This is just very basic, so we are just starting the server directly, but there are command line options where you can say that what kind of a session it is a Yarn session, or what kind of other options do you want to give, like what interpreter do you want to use. Those all things are there in the command line options. So Livy is up and running. We will take a look at some of the REST calls that we can make with Livy. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a session in Livy. So that's provided by this sessions endpoint, and you need to give your kind over here, like Scala or PySpark or R, something like that. You give your, let's say I just want a Scala session, Scala interpreter. So you will send your request to the Livy server, and what you get back is a session ID. So session ID, with that session ID, you can make your further requests. So I think I need to restart it. Let me just restart that thing. Maybe it is dead. Yeah. So you got back a session ID from Livy. So your ID is 0 and it says your kind is Spark. So now what you need to do, you got a session ID. Now any further queries that you will make to Livy, you will have to use this session ID. So let's say I want to now execute some statement on Livy, on Spark. So I use my session ID here. This is the endpoint looks like this, sessions, session ID and statements. And then inside your post body, you can have your code. So I have like a code where I am creating a data frame and I am doing just a print of that data frame. So I will send this code to Livy, and what I get is, okay, so another thing with Livy is that as you see here, you got an ID back. This is a statement ID, so it has not given you the result of that statement. So Livy has all the calls are like async calls. So basically, you have to go and poll back for that result. So there is a timeout. So right now, actually, the timeout is very small. That is why we are getting like you have to go and poll for the result. But if you increase the timeout value, you can also like get sync results back in sync. So right now we have this 0 statement ID. So let's go back and query the statement result. So I basically, again, the similar kind of endpoint sessions, you have the session ID, statements, you have the statement ID, and you will give you back the results. So that's the thing, like you have to go and poll back for your results, but that timeout option is configurable. You can increase your timeout and you can get back results in sync.
Will this session be a forever? So you're creating a session?
No, there is a predefined timeout in Livy.
Question.
Okay, he's asking if there is the session lasts forever, right? So there is a predefined timeout, but you can, I think you can change that using a config parameter on the command line. So that is what Livy, that's a small demo of Livy. So Livy, we saw that, but Livy also actually supports batch statements. So like this was like an interactive call with Livy. Livy also supports batches, executing jobs. So you can on this link you can see. So you can send your like jars on this endpoint called batches, and you can also execute your complete jars on the Spark cluster using Livy. So okay. Let's go to the, okay. So as we saw now, Livy supports these multiple sessions. So you can like create so each session is basically one Spark context. So that means that you can have like multiple Spark contexts with Livy. So Livy is maintaining this map of this session, this Spark context, and but that's all in like one Livy server. So that's a map which Livy maintains in memory. So that's something like you can use Livy, but you have the problem here that if you want to scale out Livy and if you want to load balance your Livy server, your map is like it's only in one node. So you cannot like really load balance it and say that okay, the moment you hit any other node, your map is going to be there and your session will be mapped to a Spark context successfully. So you will have to like do something like probably some kind of even if you load balance Livy and use it, you will have to probably do something like a sticky session or something, so that for the same session you always hit the same node, you have the map there, you know which Spark context to go to on Spark. So that's a little bit of an issue with Livy, but you have it available there. Did you try it recently?
Yeah, maybe 1 month back.
Okay. So yeah, actually even I haven't tried with this.
I'm not sure why will anybody go to job server. Maybe I can get your, when you have kernel other one, because here every code that you want to run, you want to create a jar and push the jar to the other side. So you really can't do interactive analytics in this mode, right?
Okay.
So this is like
a simple thing. Our app is done and it runs independently. We just need to trigger it with a REST packet.
Oh, this is like one time done. There's no ad hoc coming in on the fly.
Fixed, yeah.
Okay. So then it's fine. Then if you're a fixed one, I don't know, Spark Submit also you can use. Because these are for really interactive. Like on the fly, I keep giving you commands, go execute it, come back from the cluster, respond. So those are the use cases. If you have a fixed jar which is not changing, then job server is fine. For that matter, even you can run Spark Submit itself.
One more question: which one would you recommend for a RESTful, triggering of jobs, Spark jobs? Which of these apps, which of these frameworks would you recommend?
Correct. That's what she's going to talk about in the last half of it. Given all these ones, which use case you want to go to which technology? She'll spend enough time on it.
I mean, we have talked about it a bit like already in the questions, but
there's one. There's Spark itself has a REST, I think, a hidden REST API, something like that.
Not that I know of. Spark REST APIs.
So that's why these projects came up, because Spark doesn't give you a
I read a
vector
blog post actually. I read a blog post that said that Spark has a hidden, non-documented REST API.
We are not aware of it.
It's hidden from us.
Just to add on that, yeah, they do have a API to do Spark Submit. If there is from 1.3.0, it's not hidden. It's just purely documented. They do have a way to call Spark Submit using a REST API. It's a little bit different than job server, but it has the documentation.
Your voice is not
Yeah. So what I was saying is that
like Spark do have a REST API to do Spark submit. It's like you are sending a Spark submit command through the UI API to submit it. The difference between a job server and that is job server has the concept of creating context and keeping track of it, which is not there in the Spark submit. It's more of like you want to just trigger the shell script and let go of. You don't do any of after that, but they do have an API.
Correct. So
it's documented obscurely. So that's
right. So the real use case here, what we're telling is about you having a common middleware across a UI that you designed. And this UI is come for different users are coming and playing in that UI. So the middleware is like a load balanced middleware, right? So in that middleware, you're getting calls from different users. So the goal for you there is, how do I track that calls from a particular user are going to a particular JVM where the Spark context.
This is tough to
The
track.
key of the interactive analytics when we're talking in is there's a UI in the picture, multi-users are coming and playing in the user, or it's a multi-tenant cluster where the middleware is serving for everybody. In that use case, I think you will need a place where you have to isolate the user to the Spark context. And that's where Livy or kernel will help you because you can create that isolation. But what, as he was mentioning, if there is no way for you to isolate the Spark context, you really can't have more than one user, right? Because you're fixing yourself to a particular user because the Spark context is only one. So that's a major one.
Okay. So job server provides REST interface, like we said, and it supports multiple Spark contexts. So you can have multiple Spark contexts inside job server. So basically, job server spawns different JVMs to hold these Spark contexts. As we saw in the first half, that each Spark in one JVM you can have only one Spark context. That's a big limitation that we have currently. So this job server is forks out different JVMs for a different Spark context. And if you just install job server on in a local development mode, you won't there it doesn't do the Spark context in multiple JVMs. It uses some tricky class loader stuff to basically have your multiple Spark contexts in the same JVM, but that's not a production recommended setting. So whenever if you are using job server for something more than a local development and probably for some production kind of scenario, then you need to have that setting set to true, which is this setting in the job server, so that you can have different JVMs for a different Spark context. So job server exposes APIs to upload your jars. You can get your context, you can run your jobs, get your data, you can even configure your context. And the REST layer is basically Spray, and it uses Akka actors and Akka clusters heavily for doing this JVM management and having these separate contexts. So let's see an example of job server. So I have the job server running. So job server, again, I just pulled it and I built the job server. So you need, in your SPD console, you can say restart and your job server will start there. So since this is a local development mode, there are no additional settings or any config options are given there. So now what you can, now that your job server is up, so I'll also show you a UI. So once your job server is up, it will have a UI also for you. So that's your job server UI. It will show you what all are the jobs, these are the jobs that previously executed. And what all are your current contexts. Right now we don't have any context in job server. We are in jars which we uploaded previously. So let's do some curl calls with the job server. So I just uploaded a jar to job server, and my jar got uploaded here. This is the meetup jar which I just uploaded. Now the second thing I need to do is I need to create a context in job server. So I'm going to create a context called test context. The name is test context, and I've just given some options like I want this many codes and this many memory per node. So it has created my context. We can see it here. This is my test context which got created. So to execute now, let's take an example of what I'm going to execute on the job server. So the main thing with job server is now, you see the small sample code with, to run a job on job server. You have to, your class which you are going to execute on the server has to extend this Spark job trait which the job server provides. So it defines two methods that you necessarily need to implement. One is the run job, which will have your logic of actually what you want to run on Spark, and validate. Validate is primarily used for something like you want to use the, like you are passing some configuration to the job, and from the job config which is passed as a parameter here config, you want to do some validation that whether some kind of parameters are there in the config or not. Right now I'm just passing like true kind of a thing like Spark job value. So this is my job. I'm just creating an RDD here, and I'm just like mapping them, multiplying all of them by 2, and just doing a sum of the whole thing and printing it out. To run this code on job server, now the next thing that I have to do is I'm going to run this another curl column. So that's my result from the job that just got executed. I can also see this job on the job server. So that's my job server test which I just now executed. So that's one example of job server. Another thing job server gives is job server also provides like a named RDD support. So basically they provide a trait which you can, if you implement it, you can also have this capability that you can share your RDDs in the same Spark context across different jobs. So let's say I created an RDD in one job and then I want to use it in some other job on the same context. So I can, if I extend this trait over here in my class, jobs, and so what you need to do is it will expose you a map, this named RDDs. You need to update that map saying that like sort of store my RDD name. So you give a RDD name here and you give your RDD variable, and your RDD will get named and it will be stored in the job server. So let's say you are executing some other job after some time on the same context, you can use the same RDD instead of creating it again. So that kind of a support job server gives with this named RDD support trait. And this similar thing you can like run here. So we'll see first execution where I'm updating this, using this and updating this in the job server. And then we will see another example where this is another job, same context, but I'm going to retrieve it and do some operation on it. So it's a simple example, but I'm just going to execute it. So that's my RDD which I created in the first one. And basically what I did is, this was my input string. I just split it into words, and then using the same RDD, I did a filter on that. So it got back the results using the same RDD. So that's the the two main things in job server. You have to, any code that you implement for job server, you have to extend the Spark job trait and implement these methods. And you have to have this whole jar, and you have to upload this jar to the job server before you can execute code. So that's about all these like the demo and all I have for this 3 tools.
Are these jars and RDDs, are they persistent and recoverable as say the job server?
So jar is uploaded. So jar is there on the node where the job server is running. It will be there. And RDD is like, as long as the Spark context is there, your RDD will be there.
So if say the job server crashes,
yeah,
you did a lot of work and you want to recover that, is it possible?
So once the Spark context is gone, unless you have done some kind of a persist or something of your RDD or data frame, you will lose your stuff.
I have one question. If there is a limitation of 1 GB for one Spark context, so what would be the advantage of creating several Spark contexts like kernel, and how will it take the multi-cluster and the parallel processing advantage in heavy computations?
No, so it depends on your use case. Like if you have to have that kind of an isolation between your users, but you cannot give them the space in Spark context because they may be doing some kind of or data science kind of a use case where they may be creating data frames and creating new data sets, playing with those data sets. Then if you have to provide that isolation, then you will have to go for something like a Spark context, spawning different Spark contexts, meaning spawning different JVMs. But if you are okay with you don't need that kind of an isolation and you just like have to go and read data on Spark and you have to execute some queries against it, then you really don't need different Spark contexts. The same Spark context you can use, and Spark context supports parallel execution of queries, so that should be good enough for you.
Each kernel is actually a JVM. So that JVM holds the Spark context. So when 5 users come in and fire queries, behind the scenes you start actually 5 kernel instances. That means 5 JVMs, and each of these JVM hold a Spark context. So that's the only way you can parallelize on. Spark context to the user isolation you can only do by creating a JVM. There's no other option.
In the context of one user giving a heavy request, so and it is resulting in one Spark context being executed in one JVM, whereas the cluster might be having some 20 nodes.
Correct.
So how is this the request getting spawned into multiple executions, the parallel?
Oh, so that is different. So you are telling a single user firing one job, how does it parallelize in the back?
Right.
Oh, so that
Not
is
as a
based
Spark
on.
submit, but as a code submit.
So your question is, a user submitted a job, but thereafter how do we parallelize? That's a question. Oh, so that is very different than what she's explaining. So that is about how do you create the partitions. So if you get a job, and after that if you want to parallelize, so the question is about, there is a user who submitted one job, so it landed in one JVM, there is one Spark context, but the cluster has 10 or 15 nodes. How do we parallelize the job behind the scenes? So that is about, there is a task scheduler, scheduling one. So now let's say this job does reading an RDD and you create 10 partitions, and then those partitions will run, the task scheduler picks it up, sends it, and executor picks up, runs it. That's a different behind the scenes scheduling.
That is the case of a jar being submitted. When you say job here, it is in the form of a jar submitted.
No, when you say job, you're telling an action.
No, he's asking, I think, when you give a job, can you divide it between different Spark contexts? That's what he asking.
So one job, if you want to define different Spark contexts, you have to build that in your middleware where it lands in different JVMs. That has to be built. What these technologies will give you is, there is a capability for you to create Spark context on the fly by spinning a JVM. That's the base product. Now, if you say for a particular user itself, I want to create n different Spark contexts, you build that layer in the middle, leveraging kernel. So let's say you have some flag. Okay, this flag, if it says A, for the same user, I want to spin a kernel. Then for A, you create another client object, spin a kernel. If the flag is B, you create another one. So that logic you have to build in the middleware.
But we cannot share data between those. Yeah, that's what.
Actually, you cannot share. Data cannot be shared. I am not saying that is okay. So his point is, for a single user, how do we spin multiple Spark contexts?
So when you say that any action is a job in this architecture, when you say any action is a job, that means that any small code snippet is also which is flying from the UI.
So it doesn't matter. Yeah. So if you give one line collect, that is a job for Spark. So any action will result in a Spark job.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Yeah, so with that we have come to the end of this, and we'll just spend like 5 minutes on what all we saw today and how, when to use what. So this is the slide which we had covered earlier. So we saw like Spark Shell, Spark Submit, we saw Jupyter Notebook, we saw Zeppelin, we saw Livy, we saw Job Server, and we saw Kernel. So like we said, like Spark Shell, Spark Submit, we are like command line tools there for us. Like if you want, as a developer, you just want to like get started with Spark, play around with Spark, but not you cannot like build an application around with these tools. So and then we saw 2 notebooks, Zeppelin and Jupyter. So both Zeppelin and Jupyter give you like one Spark context, and you can start writing code snippets in them and start executing code on Spark. But that is if you cannot build full reporting solutions out of a Zeppelin or Jupyter notebook. You would probably have more use cases like multi-tenancy, and you will probably want to scale your application, and you would have like multiple users coming in and different kind of use cases. So Zeppelin and Jupyter are not really meant for that kind of use case. You can have a data science kind of a use case. You go and create new data sets and play around with those data sets in those notebooks. Then we saw the other three different tools like Libby, Job Server, and Kernel. So let's take Job Server first. So like we just discussed, Job Server has this huge limitation of uploading jars and extending their code and writing your own code. So with that limitation in building interactive applications with Job Server will be a huge challenge. So Job Server also, like, so if you're fine with having a kind of like one code, and you will always use that kind of a thing, like have a jar and basically need a REST endpoint to sort of submit your jars to do the context management, then you can go for Job Server. But again, there are limitations. Then let's take Libby. So Libby is, like we said, Libby gives you multiple sessions, gives you multiple contexts, has REST endpoints to work with. But again, Libby, with its single node maintenance of this mapping and everything, Libby has this problem of how to scale out your solution with Libby. But yes, you can use Libby in a kind of like to build your application. Let's say you want to build a UI on top of Spark, and you need that interface between Spark and your UI as your middle layer. You can use Libby, but we will have this problem of scaling out with Libby because all your mappings are done on the Libby server. So then let's come. The last thing we have is the Spark kernel, which we saw a little more in depth. So kernel, like we saw, kernel as such, kernel has one context. It meant like gives you only one context per instance, and you need to use the client library. But kernel, with kernel, you can, like, if you have a scenario where you want to do a user isolation and you want to like build a full-blown reporting solution with multi-tenancy, you can spawn different kernels, you do a lifecycle management of kernels, and have your multiple clients talking to kernel. So kernel can be used in both the scenarios. So you, with this spawning multiple kernels, you can have this user isolation. And let's say you really don't need that kind of a user isolation. You're fine with just having some data sets on Spark, and you are just reading them, querying them, and you're just like doing some, building some dashboards out of them. Then you are fine with even one kernel instance. Kernel gives you scalability because it uses Akka, and you can have multiple clients, or you can have one client. Client also has an Akka layer. So with that, you can talk to the kernel and build an application. Yes, you need to have like a REST or something on top of kernel to act like a middleware between a UI and Spark. But kernel gives you that flexibility that you can go either ways. So that's what I think. Yeah, something to add.
So actually, if we step back and see, right, why all these projects came back in, right? So what is it people need? Usually, in a setup like database, there is one server or process running in, and we have 10 connection pools, 100 connection pools, and people just pick up one connection from the connection pool and use interactive analytics. That's pretty much what we do standard, right? So why can't we do the same thing? The key problem is, Spark context, can I spin in multiple of them? You can't do that with a single JVM and do it because Spark context is not serializable. That is the biggest bottleneck in this whole thing, if you see. If Spark context is serializable, I can maintain a pool of myself within a single JVM some level. So I can say I store it and I send the Spark context to you interactive. So you can't do it. Now boil down, if you do any wrapper on top of Spark context, let's say Spark kernel does it and it gives you a client object. Because the underlying is not serializable, any of the objects which are wrapped on top of any projects, it can be Levy, kernel, anybody, you cannot serialize that object. So now you are stuck with a situation where for every user, if you need an isolation, you need to spin up a JVM. So now we have like a multi-tenant cluster we are having in. We are finding this as a serious limitation, but if anybody faces this problem or something, you can say, spinning too many JVMs, because if 1,000 users come in, I have to spin up minimum 1,000 JVMs, because everybody needs some level of isolation. And this is the biggest problem. Whichever technology you go, there has to be some JVM because underlying Spark expects you to have a JVM. And these things are not really serializable, right? So now what do you do? Let's say you build a middle tier, which is a multi-tenant middle tier. Now if I load balance that middle tier, I need to keep this client object, for example, in Spark kernel somewhere as mapping because user can come in the first time, he can do a load in node 1, he can come. In the next request, the same user can go to node 2 because I'm load balancing my middle node. So how do I pick it up? Because he's not local, right? The Spark context has to be somewhere outside. Now I cannot write it to any place because it's not serializable. Now we need to build it some solution or an in-memory solution, which is a non-serializable way of you writing it. And it cannot be over the network because again it's not serializable. There's like quite an amount of challenges exist on it. That's why all these technologies came. And all these technologies, even though it's there, you can't straight away embrace it when it comes to a multi-tenant cluster when you're doing it. You have to build a layer in the middle, which we are also trying to build it. That's what we are now. Building the layer between a kernel and the UI and where you maintain all these mappings of your kernel instance. So actually, you can open up for questions now. When do you think, or if you have any questions, you can open it. I think the session is over.
No, there's one more PPT.
No, after the question session, we will go for it. Yeah.
But is there a real use case where thousands of users in the data that
Correct, yes.
Is there a real use case where thousands of users are trying to use the system?
Correct. So ours is a use case like that. So what we are building is, we're building one huge multi-tenant cluster, which is like a platform provides it. And then on top of that, there are different solutions of IBM which comes and lives in. And these solutions have 10 different customers. Like one of the solutions can be Pepsi is a customer, Coke is a customer, Procter & Gamble is a customer. Like that, N solutions live in, and each of these N solutions have N of the customers. But there's a single multi-tenant giant cluster which is serving everybody. So that's our use case. So if you're spinning up separate clusters, you won't have a problem. Ours is one giant multi-tenant cluster.
These Spark kernels, suppose I install 2 Spark kernels. So those 2 are interactive with only whatever we have Spark. So we need to install different Spark.
He's asking whether 2 kernels are talking to the same Spark cluster or different clusters.
Yeah, it's the same cluster. So the cluster is the same. It's just that where the program runs in, we call it as a driver. The kernel is your driver. That's all it is. We spin some JVM on the fly and we treat it like a driver. But the cluster is underlying with the same cluster.
No further questions?
Excuse me. Yeah. If I have a fixed jar and if my arguments keep on changing, so how can I trigger the Spark submit? I have to use job server. I have fixed jar and the arguments keep on changing.
Fixed jar arguments keep on
so you basically you mean your config parameters to your
they change.
Yeah, so with the job server you can with the fixed jar, like we did, you had a jar already uploaded, and then you can have a curl manage, we were doing an input string, that kind of config you can give, and you can, depending on what you are executing, you can change your config there and execute.
But can I trigger the Spark submit in that way normally?
So it will be a new Spark submission.
Is there any API for triggering the Spark submit?
Spark submit is like a command line API, so you execute that command with your jar.
You can use Spark submit if you are ready. You can use Spark submit if you are ready to go every time go and invoke a shell. If you are not, if you have something where UI is talking to some APIs, then you can use job server.
See, as long as you have one user, one Spark context, if that's what you want to do interactive, you should do Spark shell. Best is Spark shell. When you're only one user, it gives you a very clean way of doing it. The use case, all these things you will need only when you have one UI, where N users are there, and the middleware actually is also one giant load balanced middleware, which is managing all these users. Then only you need all these things of how do I spin on the fly Spark context, how do I map this user to that particular driver. All these questions come in only these 2 use cases. It's one user, this one, I think you should straight away use only Spark shell. You should not even think about it.
So is there a use case? Yeah, go ahead. Just one, let him finish.
So with respect to the user management, we are thinking of spawning separate kernels to have individuality of the person, right? So why can't we have some kind of ACLs within the data sets what we are going to create? So
It's not
It's
user
very simple.
isolation. It's not user isolation. It's actually the Spark context isolation. It has nothing to do with we building it. It's about, so what is Spark context? Is your Spark already using it? Oh, okay. So Spark context is write one variable program. And you say, well, I read a file, I store it in a variable called df. That's stores as a data frame. When you say Spark context, this data frame is associated to that Spark context. If some other user comes in and he uses the same Spark context, he can actually see the df. He can read a read. So that is Spark context, just the highest level.
Spark context just acts like a namespace. It's
No,
a
it's
job
like a
con.
namespace.
It's a namespace or
Yes.
job con. Yeah.
Exactly, namespace with all the set of configurations. Correct. So now, if two users you want to provide isolation where they cannot see each other data set, there is no other option for you other than creating an individual Spark context. Because that's what Spark provides. It's nothing to do with any of these solutions. The Spark architecture enforces that that's the only way to enforce it.
So don't they have a privileges over it? To access the data set, don't they have a privileges on the top of context?
See, that privilege is a different, right? So, for example, when you say privilege, you read from a HDFS file. Your privilege is on the HDFS privilege. The moment you have read it, thereafter you have the data in the in-memory. It can be a data frame, it can be an RDB. Thereafter, there is no other external authorization which comes into play. You cannot build any other authorization because you are in an in-memory role. So, till you have an external dependency, that external dependency data store can have authorizations. That's it.
So in your use case, you mentioned that you have one giant cluster serving lots of applications. So what is the advantage of using one giant cluster over several small clusters?
Resource utilization. Simple resource utilization. If I have multiple small clusters, let's say three clusters I have, so customer one is not at all there, my resources are sitting over there idle, right? So wherein the third user in the third cluster want to have more resources than what he has. Pure resource utilization, that's the reason why multi-tenancy came in.
So my question is on the same thing. So what we're talking about is basically like an isolation and execution, right? Basically on the execution. But when you're storing, let's say you have multiple customers and all the customers' data is being stored in a single cluster, which is a Spark cluster. So where do you provide the data isolation?
And that is at the HDFS level or at the object store level. Either at the HDFS level or at the object store level, we have isolation. So let's say when you do a read, we actually go to Swift. So the data store isolation at the Swift, so user has to provide his credentials for us to go read that one. Yeah. Or HDFS, there is an authorization plug into HDFS.
So again, like if you have read the data, how you are managing the isolation at the time?
After that is through Spark context. The moment you have read the data, it's in memory. The isolation is through Spark context.
So on your application, you are actually maintaining that kind of isolation.
Spark maintains that through Spark context, but you will maintain that through the mapping which you have to bind it. This user is this particular kernel instance or Spark context instance.
Okay, but I was just saying like I have a single context and there are two users. So initially I might have given you the authorization for the SDFS level where you can access the data. And once you have get the data in your context again at the same thing.
Correct. So the moment you have one context, two user, after reading, there is no isolation because you already given one Spark context.
On kernel level also you
because you are using same Spark context, right? Two users, same Spark context.
But when I'm giving a call, at the time I will probably be knowing that this is the authorization for this user and probably upload the data somewhere.
No. Okay, so how do I explain? So let me repeat your question so that I understand your question. It's two users want to share one Spark context, but the HDFS isolation or authorization is given for one user. That's what you did.
So when what I am looking at, there are three layers. One is the SDFS layer, other is the Spark layer, which is our context, and third is your middle layer.
Correct.
So what I am saying, like on SDFS layer, you have authorization where you can actually access the data per user basis. Now middle layer, which is a Spark context, you don't have that authorization.
Correct.
But the call is always coming from your middle layer, which is the top layer.
Okay. So the middleware cannot give any isolation because the execution, if you see the Spark architecture, the actual execution happens on the Spark driver, which is a different JVM than the middleware JVM. The middleware JVM is not doing the actual work, is not doing the actual computation on the Spark cluster. When you give it to the JVM and the driver, Spark driver, which is what doing the computation, which is different than the middleware.
Yeah. I was just thinking in that context, anyways the job is being submitted by the kernel, right? So that time probably be knowing what are the resources is going to access.
No, in this use case, there is only one kernel because one Spark context, one kernel.
Yes.
The middleware doesn't know, middleware will just give, middleware is not doing the execution.
Kernel is a middleware for me right now.
If kernel is a middleware, then there is only one JVM, right? All users will come to only that JVM. So the Spark context is there. So you can't do anything, they will see each other data set in the in-memory data set. So maybe we want to get some feedback as usual. Every session after that, we want to get some feedback from you guys. The same topic or anything else you want to add in, or you want to do it differently, we want to collect some feedback actually.
Can you
Was
do
it useful or
a
you need
based
more?
on Elasticsearch? Can you read the native use case where Elasticsearch is used along with everything?
Elasticsearch used with mlib. You want to have a session, huh?
Yeah.
But this Elasticsearch is completely outside of this context, but you want to, with mlib you want to see.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are going to do one session on machine learning extensively to see how because we are extended a lot from the machine learning framework, and we are in fact working with Databricks to open source that layer itself. We will talk about that in one of the presentations. Maybe there we will get some inputs from you to see how we go.
Yeah, how do you manage resource using kernels? You are starting JVM in one machine itself or in a cluster?
We are starting JVMs in a one machine or a cluster?
Ours is a cluster. So ours is quite different. Each of that is actually a Docker container. So we leverage Docker to spawn JVMs across the place.
Is there any syncing between Spark context? Suppose you launch just 4 or 5 JVM, but you are submitting in a single cluster. So suppose one kernel you have started and you already took all the resources. So if you start again if you start second kernel, then how is you have a message or something? Because it will not start right.
So basically, yeah, I mean, if you give the options of everything that is there on the node to the same kernel, you cannot spawn any other kernel on that same node. But you will have to, if you're spawning multiple kernels on the same node, you have to give appropriate values for your memory, for your cores, executors. So at the time of starting the kernel, you will have to give those values as.
We leverage through the yarn itself upfront because there's a cluster manager, because it's a multi-tenant cluster, right? So we don't directly go at the yarn level, we configure for you. You as a user, how much resources you can share.
Bharat, we'll continue with the slides now.
No, it's good. It's good.
What if the kernel goes down?
What if the kernel goes down? There is a different ways you can do fault tolerance on that. So there is.
What kind of fault tolerance mechanism we have?
So see, what if the kernel goes down? You can actually, in a regular flow, I don't know how much of important you want to checkpoint the DAG itself, but you have capability where you can checkpoint the DAG, checkpoint the RDD and come back. It depends on your use case. If you want complete fault tolerance, then you need to checkpoint at different level, and there are ways for which you can checkpoint and come back. And based on that, the driver will, there is an auto restart feature in the driver where you can set it up in the cluster mode, where the driver will come back, knows how to read from the checkpoint, build it in. It purely depends on how critical for you is. Instead, if I'm okay, I can relaunch the job itself. Is that simple, or it's a long running job, I finish 50%, but I don't want to restart because it can take another 10 hours. Then in the use case, yes, there are ways how you can checkpoint and get back the data.
Is the job server itself or
the driver in general he wants to?
I thought he was asking about the job server. Suppose if I was using Apache Tori and it crashed, what failover does it have?
Oh, so your question is not just the driver. Oh no, I was telling about the Spark driver basically. Kernel specific for
So kernel, if your kernel dies, they don't give any such thing
So
you have to build
it. You'll see a slew of projects coming up.
Very difficult. So these are all very initial stage from learning. It's not fully mature. I think if we don't have, maybe we can jump on.
Hey, can we have a round of applause for Charlie and Mario is the singer, technical staff.
Yeah, so I'd like to thank again Charlie and Bhagwat. Right, you've seen the questions and the interactiveness of the session, right? And that leads to two things. all of you stayed here, right? I don't know whether it's just due to the way he announced it, as well as the fact that how many of you know that you are now the second largest Spark meetup in the world. This is the second largest Spark meetup in the world. Yes, and the number one is Matthias, right? So you guys are going to, help us become number one, right? So there's a reason behind, this being done at IBM, right? I think when we started the session, as well as Paranth alluded to it, IBM is our whole analytics platform. We are re-engineering it where the core of it is going to be on Spark, right? Paranth also talked about recently that the whole IBM MLlib is contributed to Apache, and parts of that are going to be integrated into Spark MLlib, right? And IBM has also been making announcements that we would train 1 million data engineers or something. I don't want to use the word data scientists because we don't know whether there are 1 million data scientists in the world, right? But engineers, yeah, definitely, and IBM will train them on Spark, right? So the commitment from IBM to Spark is pretty huge. And given that no one knows the enterprise better than IBM, right? IBM is at the forefront of driving Spark adoption in the enterprise, right? So way back in May last year, IBM started a Spark Technology Center in San Francisco, right? The goal is to go up to 300 people, I hear, who will be working on designing, adopting and ensuring that Spark succeeds in the enterprise, right? And you've seen the changes that we're doing inside IBM. So for all your good work of meeting this big, creating this big meetup, we have something to announce. IBM has announced that there will be a local Bangalore Spark Technology Center, right? And the areas that the Spark Technology Center Bangalore would work on is contributions to open source itself. So, if you are people who like doing things in the open source, which is what young jiggy people like, this is where you should be, right? And the components that we would work on is Spark Streaming itself, right? And Spark connectors, right? This is for a start, it will go beyond it. And I'd like to say that IBM has centers all over the world, right? And after San Francisco, there's no other Spark Technology Center. The second one is in Bangalore, India, not Europe, not anywhere else, right? And a good thing is, we already have on board here Prashant Sharma, who's the only Spark committer from India, and he's already on board, right? So with this, we go to the next one, that we are the Spark Technology Center, we are looking to hire, right? So please send your resumes. The email address is pawanpai@in.ibm.com, right? We are looking for folks who have good contributions to Spark. That would be a huge plus when we are looking to recruit for the STC Bangalore, right? And so please include your GitHub ID so we could, reference all your contributions to Spark as well as, outside of Spark. That was the announcement. Thank you. There's something more from Abdul.
So, how many of you recognize what is this? These are my favorite characters who have seen Madagascar. So these penguins, you give them any task, any impossible task, they'll make it happen. So I'm asking you, go back to your weekend, talk to your girlfriends, enemies, friends, mom, dad, anybody. Make sure that they register to our meetup and they'll make our meetup #1 in the world. And I'll make sure that we get a Spark committer to talk to you wherever he is. We have already recruited him. So just make sure that we get developers joining our meetup. Thank you so much.
The next meetup will be on March 12th to 22nd, within that frame. There are 2 dates, but we need to confirm on the availability of the location and rooms. So March 12th to March 22nd, one of those Saturdays is when the next meetup will be. Some of the ideas that we had from The last time we did Spark streaming, so a lot of people were asking, can you compare the various Spark streaming projects that are there? That was one idea that we had, but if you have more ideas, we're more than open to take them. Does that sound exciting to you? Okay. Thank you.
Please return all your badges to security.
We'll update the meetup description.
The objects that are created within the Spark.
No, that's okay. That's still you can maintain. So anyway, you have that family.
That's why I was saying, okay, 1 o'clock, man, stop now. I am against me, I know. Like I was about to say, man, I am against me, I
If you go back to the question number?
Sorry, not from too high. Okay. Say the last part. You want to load using that?
So like, how do we machine to use the hybrid like when we have a data frame or
whether you should use the data frame. Personally, I have not worked in the data, so I don't want to give you an answer that creative. I could ask around or